Welcome to this month's Schuman Talk, where we discuss issues we face in Europe today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for Europe as a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. You see, it was on May the 9th in 1950 at 6 p.m. that the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman gave a 3-minute speech in which he laid the foundation for the European house, where today 450 million Europeans live together in peace. And that's why we send out the Schuman Talk on the 9th day of each month at 6 p.m. For this was the defining moment of post-war Europe, at least in my book. For it launched the European movement for peace and unity that has led to today's European Union. And we can argue that that knock-on effect was the fall of the wall and even further, what the Ukrainian struggle right now can trace its roots back to the process that began on May the 9th, 1950. Now, the story of the origins of the EU usually focus on the political and economic dimensions. What's usually forgotten is the spiritual or religious dimension in making reconciliation possible between the French and the Germans, without which European integration would never have happened. Schuman was adamant this must not just be an economic and technological project, it needs a soul. And that's why last month we had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Doug Johnson, who co-edited this book called Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft, where he was making a strong case that as 80-something% of the world's population find their meaning in religion, diplomats and politicians cannot afford to ignore this dimension in the public square. And so we're thrilled that this month, following up on Dr. Doug Johnson, we have Professor Philip McDonagh, who brings a rich experience and involvement in the public square over many years, beginning as a student, as president of the Oxford Union. He was a political counsellor involved in the Northern Ireland peace process in the build-up to the Belfast Agreement. And as you can see, he was ambassador in numerous places. In fact, he comes from a family of ambassadors, his father and brothers as well. And he's been involved in India, the Vatican, Finland, Russia, and we're going to explore that Russian connection later on. But right now, he's the director of the Center for Religion, Human Values, and International Relations at the Dublin City University. So I want to welcome you, Professor McDonagh, with us. I'm going to call you Philip, but would you pronounce your surname for me? Because I think I'm murdering it.
McDonagh.
McDonagh. Okay. All right. It wasn't too bad. Welcome. And it's wonderful to be meeting you in this way. We've had the opportunity and the privilege of being in contact just last month in Rome and last week in Brussels. And so I'm thrilled that you've made yourself available for this chat today. Yes, I think I'm right in saying that your family has a rich ambassadorial history. Is that correct?
Yes. In fact, my mother also was a diplomat, but in those days you had to retire on marriage. But my mum was one of the first 3 women recruited to the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs a long time ago.
Well, I can imagine the conversation around the breakfast table would have been very diplomatic, or was it not so?
No, I think our parents were very normal people, and they didn't take the public world more seriously than they should. I think they were very concerned about justice because the families were also involved in the big transitions in Ireland, when the Irish state was established in the years following the rebellion in 1916. And it was a really important point in their thinking that one should not fall into any kind of hatred or vengefulness as you pursue political change. My grandfather actually was a leader of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was a secret organization. But he used to read P.G. Wodehouse, as an antidote to any anti-English sentiments.
The Irish Republic Brotherhood, how is that related to the IRA?
Oh, those are very complicated historical questions. But the Irish Republican Brotherhood, in my understanding, goes back to the 1880s. Oscar Wilde wrote a play about them, Vera or the Nihilists, which is set in Russia, but actually it refers to this revolutionary movement in Ireland. And then the Irish Republican Brotherhood played a major part in the rebellion in Dublin in 1916, which led to Irish independence, but it also led to a great flourishing in the arts. So one of Yeats's greatest poems, Easter 1916, is about that rebellion. And my family used to say that the test of the validity of a political movement is that it's connected to the arts and literature in a very positive way. And Shelley says the same in his book on the defense of poetry, that you feel that politics are going in the right direction when politics inspires literature. And then you look at other moments in history, where the violence and war doesn't inspire anything very remarkable in literature. And that's a warning signal, probably.
So in your family discussions, and your views on the necessity for peace and reconciliation, and what you said before, you were encouraged not to allow thoughts of hatred and division. Was that politically or ideologically motivated? Culturally, you talked about poetry, literature. Was there a faith dimension to that?
Yes, I think we're so lucky in Ireland that we've had wonderful political and literary figures who have managed to campaign for justice without abandoning their deepest human values, their belief in reconciliation and on, a win for everyone. So Daniel O'Connell, was a progressive politician of the early 19th century. He promoted Catholic emancipation at a time when Catholics lacked political rights. And he was probably the only progressive leader of that prominence in Europe who was also throughout a practicing Christian. We didn't have this split between progressive politics and religion, which occurred in many countries. And then in his time, we had the great poet Thomas Moore, who in his time was the best known English language songwriter in the world. And Thomas Moore had been through the upheavals in Ireland after the French Revolution. He had been through failed political movements based on revolutionary change. And Thomas Moore, it seems to me, wrote a poetry which accompanies the politics of Daniel O'Connell. And then, at the height of the crisis in Victorian England, when people in Britain began to wake up to the terrible ambivalence of empire, we had the fortune to have a political leader like Parnell, who was a parliamentarian and who sought change through political means. And even later, I think if you look at our prominent politicians of the early 20th century, what is really striking is their moderation and their attempt to build a future for everyone. And then, of course, you have the generation of the Good Friday Agreement, the most famous of whom is John Hume. And John Hume was a Gandhian, inspired by Martin Luther King. I knew him very well from my student days until the end of his life. And John Hume was just a model of the consistent advocacy of change through justice without hatred for anyone. And John Hume was accompanied in the literary field by a number of writers. Seamus Heaney won the Nobel Prize for poetry, Hume's exact contemporary. But there are other poets like Michael Longley and Derek Mahon who have also passed away. but they were trying to write a poetry that was equally accessible to Catholics, Protestants, Irish, British, or to a global audience. It's quite an interesting question. What is the poetry or the literature that can be read and enjoyed by everyone? And this literature of Heaney and others was the complement, in my view, to John Hume's Politics, which was based on the idea of a win for everyone. So the communities in Northern Ireland should win, the island of Ireland should win, British-Irish relations should win, and Europe should win. And John was, of course, a member of the European Parliament for decades. And he saw the Northern Ireland peace process as a micro beside the macro of Schuman's vision.
Yes, indeed. And you yourself are a recognized and published poet. Has that played any role in your role as an ambassador?
I think the difference it makes is just, I hope, a vision in which you can look behind narratives and look at what is humanly more true sometimes than the public positions that one takes sometimes, especially in a multilateral context where nobody alone can hold the pen. You're always beholden to a narrative which is, if you like, a compromise. And it's really important to have, a room behind the shop, I think Montaigne said, but a place where you can go, where you can just, to change the metaphor, you can sit in your pajamas and ask, but what should we really do now? In this sense, I think poetry and faith and history, the study, an imaginative study of history, they all come together. You always have to be in a position where you can critique the arguments that are placed in front of you. If you lose that ability, you're lost. There's the lovely French word, I think, décalage, but there's a décalage between most public narratives and some other potential truth towards which we must always try to reach.
Would I be putting you too much on the spot if I said, can you, from the top of your head, quote a verse or two to illustrate what you were saying of your own poetry or somebody else's?
Well, let me think. I have no notice of this particular question.
No, we can come back to that at the end if you like.
But also, I don't have my works in front of me at this moment.
Right. No, I just thought maybe off the top of your head, but we can perhaps come back to that later.
I'll tell you, I have a poem about John Hume. Let me see if I can just find it.
Okay. All right. While you do that, I'll just prepare our listeners for the next question I want to ask you, and that is to tell us about your role in the Northern Ireland peace process. And I have to realize these days that these things that seemed to me to have happened just a short while ago happened actually before a lot of the students that I work with were even born, and they've never heard of the Good Friday Agreement. So actually this whole peace process culminated in the Good Friday Agreement. Bill Clinton was very much involved, and I think Tony Blair, if I'm not mistaken, ending decades of sectarian violence called the Troubles by establishing power-sharing government between unionists and nationalists, guaranteeing rights, decommissioning paramilitary weapons, and it was a major turning point. And there's still tensions that have now and then come to the surface, but there's been a general stability since then. And
I could read it now. Can you see me? So I'll read my little poem.
It's going to please do that. Yeah.
So this is going to be in a new collection that will be published in the next few months. So the poem is called John Hume, Public Representative. In the beginning was the Word. In schools the welfare state built. We in the bogside, the glen and Cregan, got hold of mind's tools. we walked in the daylight with a new pride. Within stale boundaries, truth was by rote. The drumbeat of our ahistorical abstractions cornered us and crowded out fresh instincts. Still, we held on. A rebellion rooted in what a person sees beyond present alternatives began to act on others. Over time, knots were unwound. Conflict became contingency, not fact. John Hume, public representative. Once I had said it on live radio, it marked me like a sacrament, as if my life was not my own. I kept going down all the years and on to Downing Street and that last Passover until it fell, the old wolf law. Yet who can explicate, finally, great events in the detail of one life? To remember bobs and bits of ordinary decency is easier. I crossed half the world for Anne Fitt's funeral. It was winter. I was there. So
I love that phrase, knots became unwound.
yes.
That really expresses so much of the peace process, is the huge tangle that involves generations. How can you ever unwind those knots? That's a very graphic image.
Yes, and it's a new beginning. I think that maybe in your description of the peace process, perhaps you could have emphasized more that it's something that needs to be constantly assessed and reassessed, and it can give rise to further changes. We don't know when. We're not necessarily pushing in a particular direction. Some people are, of course, but nevertheless, it has this potential to lead to new developments. It's not a once and for all solution, and nothing ever is in politics.
It's not a finally set in concrete arrangement, but needs to constantly be worked on with the right attitudes from all sides. Yeah.
Yes,
what was your role in all of this?
I was posted for 5 years in London as the person in the embassy for the peace process. And I had the title of deputy head of mission. So I was next to the ambassador, but the ambassador always had a lot of tasks. He was always available for the peace process, but his duties were very wide, whereas my only task was to work on the peace process. And that had several aspects. So the first thing was to report on developments inside the British political parties. And of course, you mentioned that I had been president of the Oxford Union, and that certainly helped because I didn't know British politics very well. I had been a member of the Labour Party myself when I was a student in Oxford, but I also knew people from the Conservatives in Britain. For example, 2 successive Secretaries of State for Northern Ireland, Peter Brook and Patrick Mayhew, were former presidents of the Oxford Union from my college in Oxford. So that certainly, opens a door to friendship. So my second task was, and this is something I kind of stumbled on, but it was to talk to unionist politicians in London. That means Northern Irish unionist politicians, while they were visiting London, because it was easier for them to engage with the Irish government in London than in Dublin. So the high point of that was that I had a dialogue with David Trimble, who is the future Nobel Prize winner, in which he accepted my invitation to meet with our Prime Minister, our Taoiseach, which was his first meeting at that level. And that meeting took...
He was a Northern Ireland unionist.
Well, and he was the future leader of the unionists in the peace process. So yes. David Trimble, with John Hume, received the Nobel Prize. And so it was my privilege to talk to David and to give him the kind of assurances and confidence he needed to engage in a deep discussion with the Irish Prime Minister. And that took place in our house in London. And my wife baked a quiche for their meeting. And it was a breakthrough. And of course, I'm always very mindful of the conversations that I had with David, because it gives me an insight into what the Unionist Party expected from the Good Friday Agreement. The whole point about the agreement is there are different traditions with different narratives, and we wanted to focus on relationships and bring the narratives into some kind of dialogue. So that was my second role with talking to the Unionists. But the other thing I really must mention would be my role with prisoners. So the leader of Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams, he gave us a message that he wanted the Republican prisoners in prisons in Britain to be engaged in the peace process. Also because they had very major issues. Many of them expected never to be released from prison ever, because they didn't partake in the processes of rehabilitation which were available, because they didn't accept that that was appropriate for them. So I went to all the prisons many times. That's Whitemoor, Full Sutton, Frankland, Belmarsh, and also the women's prison, Holloway. And I had these deep discussions with the Republican prisoners, which were very moving and rewarding for me. And as a result of that, I began to meet with loyalists. They would be people from the other side of the paramilitary struggle. And one of those meetings with loyalists, I really feel I would, if you had a moment for me to talk about it, I would, because it was the most extraordinary revelation to me. This was Gusty Spence. And Gusty Spence had just been released, or he had recently been released from prison, not just released, but he was the leading advocate of the peace process among the loyalist former paramilitaries. And I was invited to meet him. And he had at least 50 bodyguards, and they all sat at a slight distance, and I was put sitting right in front of Gusty. And I asked him how he came to this vision of peace. And he said, "Have you ever heard of William Redmond?" And as it happens, I had also even written a poem about William Redmond. William Redmond was an MP who asked Irish people to join the British Army during the First World War. But unlike so many others, he felt he should therefore serve himself. And at a certain moment in 1917, he was the oldest serving officer on the Western Front. He was 56, a member of Parliament in the front line. He could easily have got a position behind the lines, but he wrote a letter saying that if he were to pull out of active duty, it would undermine the prospects for future reconciliation between Unionists and Nationalists. So he served in the front line for that reason. And in June 1917, he took part in an advance at a place called Vichata, which was the only time in the entire First World War when the Ulster Division and the Irish Division advanced together. And he was wounded, and he was picked up by the stretcher bearers of the Ulster Division, who brought him behind the lines, where he took 12 hours to die. And Gusty Spence's father was there. And Gusty said to me that his father told him never to lapse into hatred of the other, because he said, "Me da saw Willie Redmond die." And so I said to Gusty, so, people think Willie Redmond's career was one of the byways of history. It's forgotten. But you're telling me that the loyalist cessation of violence goes back to Flanders. And yes. Gusty said to me, "Yes, that's what I'm telling you." And
wow, that was a special connection.
Then I heard myself saying something that my mother used to say: "God spoke last." And Gusty Spence said, "Yes, God spoke last." So what this shows me is that change in politics happens as a gift. You might say a gift of, well, from a religious point of view, a gift of God. And this is very much what people like John Hume and Seamus Heaney also believed. So Seamus Heaney has these images of the cloudburst or the tidal wave. So the idea is you act with integrity as best you understand it, and in due course that will bear fruit. It's given. Gusty Spence was a really remarkable person, and people typecast people like that, without maybe understanding that people can change. And that was also John Hume's vision very much. People change if you get involved in a dialogue. John asked me to go with him to the Tamil tigers in the jungle, the LTTE, when he was asked to mediate. And John's
in Sri Lanka.
Yes.
Yes. Sri Lanka, yeah.
Yes. So John's view was, if you give people space, you ask them to articulate their position as best they can, you then have something to work with. And you can even help them to articulate their position in a way that could be more easily aligned with the alternative position. But now anyway, the prisoner, my dealings with the prisoners were a great opening for me to understand, how change can happen.
Now, you're directing the Center for Religion, Human Rights and International Relations. And of course, the whole Irish question, the Northern Ireland question, was so laden with religious connotations. And yet, you're also showing that, well, let me put it this way, and this was the second question I want to ask you. What role can religion play in peace building and building cohesion in divided communities?
Yes.
Is it a matter of getting religion right rather than wrong? What lessons can be drawn from your involvement with the Good Friday Agreement? Now, you just mentioned Sri Lanka. I wasn't aware of that, but I am aware of you have been involved in Korea and Palestine as well. To what degree does religion play a positive factor in peace building?
Well, we have this book. Our center has, some of my friends and I have published this book on the significance of religion for global diplomacy, where we offer a whole argument about this. I think, first of all, the Northern Ireland conflict was about culture and the economy and ethnicity as much as it was about religion. I think it's sometimes wrongly read by outsiders, often those who want to say that religion is a problem. But actually, in Northern Ireland, there were many different elements in play, as there always are in a political situation. So where does religion come in? I think humility must be mentioned. Is it in St. Matthew, you have the passage about, praying. When you ask God for something, you have to be sorry for your own sins and then talk about your neighbor. We have to remove the beam from our own eye. Mm-hmm. I think very often in a political situation, people present themselves robustly as the right side without that humility. I think also complexity is something that you have to acknowledge from a religious point of view. Again, to go back to the Gospels, Jesus speaks about the two kings who are going to war against each other, and how it would be much better if they sent envoys to discuss the business of peace. Now, that phrase, the business of peace, it occurs also in a passage when Jesus is entering Jerusalem and he's lamenting the fate of Jerusalem and saying, if only you understood the business of peace. So the business of peace is about going more deeply into the situation in the way I tried to describe before. I think also Religion gives perspective. I know we're going to talk in a moment about hunger in the world, but I think if you have a sense of I don't know, but of a reality. I mean, I say God. I know Buddhists might use a different word, but if you have a sense of a great reality beyond and above ourselves, you have to look at a big picture. So in Northern Ireland, there was always the risk of what Seamus Heaney called hugging our little destiny again and not seeing the bigger picture in the world. So I think religion gives us a window on a much bigger picture. I think also religion, our faith tells us that there is a truth in situations. And this truth is often some action that we can't immediately foresee. It doesn't mean applying some big principle and then coming up perhaps with the help of AI with some kind of formula. But as Pope Francis says, especially in a passage that I love in Amoris Laetitia, the natural law is only a general guide to conduct. What is more important is a deep knowledge of the situation. So this willingness to delve deep also comes to us through faith. So I think I've been offering some ideas here which are really about methodology. It's about understanding how evil spreads in the world. Evil is like a disease that metastasizes. And what are the dynamics of society that contain evil? And it involves these virtues that I've been trying to describe, such as humility and acknowledging complexity and having a wide perspective and acting as if time is on our side. So it's really important to start a process that's capable of leading in the right direction. So it's an orientation and a methodology, and it's one that's available to people from different world religions. Pope Francis, in his wonderful letter from his deathbed to Corriere della Sera, he called on all the world religions to come together and reignite the spirituality of humanity in the cause of peace.
Well, let's try to apply that thinking in terms of the current war going on between Russia and Ukraine. You were ambassador in Moscow for 4 years,
Yes.
just up until before the Crimea occupation. And we know how, in many ways, Putin he sees himself as a defender of the Orthodox Christianity. And we see perhaps we could very quickly call that a misuse of religion. But what role do you see for religion in peace building between those two nations? Did you have any personal contact with Putin yourself?
Not with President Putin, no, but with many of the people close to him. So what one, I think, has to say is that there are people of tremendous capacity in Moscow. The foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has been there for a long time. He has very capable people working with him. So there's no danger that messages will not be understood. It's a very credible diplomatic tradition in Moscow. I wonder what one can say that would be helpful here. Maybe the most important thing and our most important duty from a religious point of view is to understand their narrative. It's a very compelling narrative in many ways. I think it has to begin with the very sad fact that Germany's war of annihilation in Russia overlapped with the Holocaust. And in many ways, it shared the spirit of the Holocaust. And from a Russian or Soviet point of view, the 27 million dead in the war, which saved the West, if you like, is something that should be remembered. And a Russian audience would find it very difficult to understand how, for example, the German government makes every allowance for Israel in very questionable circumstances, and yet seems to have no active historical memory of what was done in the Soviet Union. So that's...
Are you talking about Israel and Gaza right now? Is
yes,
that what you mean?
I'm talking that Germany is hypersensitive to any pressure on Israel for historical reasons, and yet doesn't seem to have the same conscience when it comes to Russia, where acts of equivalent savagery were carried out. And also other actors in Europe, when they thought it was likely that Germany would win the war, were also involved in the Soviet Union in a way which they prefer to forget. So the wartime history is very important. If you live in Moscow, maybe now people are getting older, but you see so many old ladies out in the park on the day they commemorate the war, dancing on their own. And the reason for that is their men never came back. So you just see large crowds of women dancing, and they only come out that once a year. Every family you meet in Moscow has a story going back to that time. So that's the first thing that has to be remembered. I think the second thing is about the post-Cold War history in Europe. I was in the External Action Service, as it's now called. I was desk officer for the CSCE, and I sat at lots of the meetings 1990, 1991, when we moved as the European community, as we then were, to recognize all the parts of Yugoslavia and all the parts of the Soviet Union as new states. Now, the Helsinki principles at that time were 10, and they still are 10 principles, but I can safely say there was no attempt to correlate these political changes with the 10 principles. And instead, under American leadership, this model of politics was created in which NATO was to be seen as a security provider. So security was to be a commodity, which was somehow to be obtained by overwhelming military superiority. And we in the European Union decided to equate the enlargement of the European Union with the enlargement of NATO. So this is, if you like, the second thing that the Russians will point out. And I think they're correct in saying that there were assurances given to Moscow and to Gorbachev at that time that NATO would not expand. And you can then look into the details of lots of other situations. I would find it very interesting to compare the way in which we in the European Union have dropped Turkey from the enlargement process, in the same way as we have split Ukraine from Russia in our own thinking. So we've created an image of Europe which is much narrower than Europe understood as a civilizational space. So none of this is said to take sides or to justify anything, but our very first duty as Christians is at least to understand what other people think and feel. Now, I would go beyond that then and say that our next duty is to make peace. And the question is, have we in the European Union in recent years had a vision of the path to peace, or have we simply relied on successive US administrations, to do this, while retaining in our own hands the ability to say no at some point? But I have a feeling we have not reached out with any vision of our own, which could possibly create the kind of win-win outcome which we were looking for in Northern Ireland. And the role of religion, you say the role of, this could be perhaps my next point. The Orthodox Church in Russia is a church of martyrs. So it has this remarkable story that great writers have come home to the church. So in Ireland, our great writers like James Joyce or W.B. Yeats or even Seamus Heaney have distanced themselves. But in Russia,
from the
someone like
church.
from the church, yes. Whereas someone like Anna Akhmatova or Nikolai Gumilyov, her husband, who was executed in 1921, or Mandelstam, who was born Jewish, but they all came home to religion. Nikolai Gumilyov is very interesting because if he hadn't been executed, he might have been the leader of that group of great writers, which also included Pasternak. But Gumilyov, before the revolution, was not religious. But after the revolution, he blessed himself ostentatiously every time he passed a church. And similarly, Akhmatova, she describes herself in her own writings as the little sinner of Tsarskoye Selo. But when she was living in Leningrad later in life, she, as you can see when you go to the place, she had an icon in the corner of every room. There's much more to be said about this, but we have no right sitting in our countries to write off this major strand in the Christian tradition. I think we should put far more effort into actually understanding what the nature of the Russian Orthodox Church is and the important discussions that take place inside the Russian Orthodox Church. I had the opportunity to speak to the Catholic bishops in the EU about the war some time ago, and I suggested that they write to the Metropolitan of Volokolamsk. That's what they call the equivalent of Archbishop Paul Gallagher in the Vatican is Metropolitan Anthony of Volokolamsk, who's a youngish archbishop whose previous work was in Italy, so he knows, the Europe of the European Union very well. I would not despair of opening up a dialogue through that channel.
So this is an indication of how, well, we could say the faith communities can play a role in building the bridges. It's what comes to my mind is St. Francis as a patron saint for diplomats, in the sense of seek to understand as to be understood.
Yes, and also he went to visit the Muslim leader, didn't he, during the Crusades? Yes, absolutely. No, absolutely. I think we have to also, I'm sorry to say this, but we have to just look around us and ask ourselves, what do people in China think? What do people in India think? What do people in Brazil think? What do people in South Africa think? The church is a universal church. The Holy See is calling for una pace disarmata e una pace disarmante. We're being called on to develop a global peace strategy in partnership with our friends all over the world. And one of the things.
Go on.
So one of the great insights of John Hume and Seamus Heaney was that conflict hurts everyone. So yes, there are narratives, some of which are more true than others. But in the end, everyone is suffering as long as the violence continues. And there's always the risk then of something morphing into something else. Evil is of its very nature shape-shifting. So if you take, the First World War, the analysis that people might have offered in Western Europe in 1914 was not necessarily valid in 1917. And the way the war ended by imposing reparations on Germany created massive problems for the future. So we've just got to ask ourselves, what is the way out of all of this? And as we found, when we were negotiating in Northern Ireland from an Irish government point of view, it was much more rewarding to try to repair relationships than to simply abolish partition. We could have easily had a narrative saying the only issue here is the border that was artificially imposed on our island. But that would have been a recipe for eternal conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So we took a step back and we opened pathways to change, ultimately based on restored relationships.
Well, in the light of what you've just been saying now, how do you evaluate the US security strategy that was published on Friday? Is this a step forward? Or
I'm tempted to say something very tactless. Will I say it or not? No. When I was working on the Republican prisoners issue in London, I went to my former classics tutor in Oxford, and I said, "Look, I'm just trying to work out. Some people say what I'm doing here is on the edge, you see." And he said, "Well, in the United States, in the campaign in which Barry Goldwater stood for president, they had the campaign slogan, 'In your heart, you know he's right.' And the Democrats invented a counter slogan, 'In your guts, you know he's nuts.' And so my tutor said, always ask yourself which of the slogans is more applicable.
Yeah.
In your heart, you know he's right, or in your guts, you know he's nuts." But having made that tactless comment, I would say that the new security strategy very interestingly uses the word civilization. And I think that's where we should look, because once we start talking about civilization, we're into the understanding of history. We're into the understanding of how, as human beings, we manage to make sense of our coexistence and to avoid this calamitous drift towards a world in which selfishness in all its forms is being ratified. And so I think if we talk about civilization, a lot of things follow. I would start in a dialogue with India, because the Indian foreign minister has asked for a dialogue at the level of civilizations. China wants to talk the language of civilizations. It would be very helpful for us in Europe to ask ourselves, what is European civilization and where its roots lie? I don't think there's any plausible reading of European civilization that excludes the Greek thinkers, Aristotle and others, and all that, the weight of Greek philosophy which was brought to bear on the Bible through the Septuagint and through the fact that the New Testament was written in Greek. I don't think we can have an account of our civilization that ignores Islam. I don't think we can have an account that ignores, I'm sad to say, the whole assumption lying behind colonialism, which was an assumption of racial superiority. I think it would be very salutary for us to discuss this, and then among ourselves, and then to ask our friends in America, how do they understand civilization? How do they accommodate various obvious facts of their own history into a narrative of civilization? How do they even draw a clear line between North America and South America and Europe in terms of a civilizational understanding of history? So I would take J. Vance at his word and say, yes, let's talk about civilization.
Yes, and we could spend a lot of time just on this, and I could try to tease out of you what your gut feeling is, but let's let's move on. But in the short time that we have still, I attended your seminar in Brussels in the European Parliament last Wednesday, where you led this discussion. You had a contingent of Irish people with you that included Muslims and Sikhs and other religions as well. A rabbi, was he a rabbi or
we have a Jewish representative? Yes, not a rabbi.
Jewish representative, yes, and you were. You are presenting the role of religion in promoting social cohesion in the city of Dublin. Can you tell us about that briefly?
Well, the city of Dublin would just be one instance, but ultimately we're hoping that it will lead to a whole process in favor.
And it was one district within Dublin. What you
yes,
were
that was a pilot project, shall we say. But the big issue is that our Prime Minister, our Taoiseach, he wants to create a structure for dialogue with churches, faith groups, and non-confessional groups to talk about the future. And this dialogue is to serve the common interest, the public interest, and it's to take us beyond the next election. It's to look more deeply into, how we come together as a society, and what is the language which we use to explain where we're going. So this is the opposite of polarization or fragmentation. It's trying to articulate a shared understanding of our values, drawing on many well-known sources, such as our Constitution or EU treaties or works of literature. And the premise is basically that every society and every democracy depends on conditions that it cannot generate by legislation. You can't pass a law saying that people should trust one another from now on. It just doesn't work like that. So you have to ask, how do you build trust? And the premise of this project is that you need to look at several different avenues to do that. They're all complementary, but they're different. So yes, we can try to articulate our basic values in terms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or all kinds of other documents, including, up to and including the 10 Commandments. But then you have to look at specific issues through which we can embody and show what we're trying to achieve. So there's a relationship between the high-level values and the particular actions. Then you have to look at local level, place-based policies. We argue then that you have to look at international comparisons, because as you so rightly pointed out, why should we work on the inner city in Dublin without also studying what's happening in Amsterdam? And then finally, we have to look at the international dimension of what we're doing. I think in this globalized world where there's so much impact of one situation on another, we need to ask where the world is going if we're to make sense of our own situation. So there has to be an international aspect to this work. So basically, we're trying to raise, if you like, the level of public debate in order to create a shared public truth. So yes, we will still have some differences, but our actions will unite us. So we had a Jesuit father from Malawi in our university last week who is working with us on getting local parish priests to work with Muslim imams and with some other Christians in the same locality to transform the way they produce food in a very, very vulnerable part of Malawi. And this visitor, our visitor, said this is interfaith dialogue by stealth, because if you work together with your Muslim friends to try to ensure that every family has some kind of security in food, in the food area, he said, A, it is a kind of dialogue, and B, it is a kind of prayer. So the hypothesis of all I'm saying is that actions unite where abstractions divide.
Yes, and what you're talking about involves inclusion and collaboration,
Yes.
which is not what the U.S. Security strategy breathes. That is appealing to the manifestos of extreme movements in Europe. But as we sat there in that room there with the Sikh with his turban on, and the Muslim and the Jew and other faiths represented, you could say it's out of a Christian motivation, but out of a human motivation to encourage the collaboration.
Well, absolutely. I think values are, in the end, human values. I think if we're Christians, we believe in the revelation in Jesus. But I think that revelation is to do with the nature of redemption. It doesn't change the domain of values in a way that separates us deeply from people of other religions or traditions. And I think, the tale of the Good Samaritan is very relevant here. Really, the test of whether we're bringing Jesus into the public sphere is the Good Samaritan test. It's not wrangling about the definition of principles. And I would also say, I wouldn't try to be party political about this. In a European context, we were in Brussels last week, we were in the European Parliament, and we learned a great deal about the whole spectrum that now is found in the European Parliament, including new groups which may not have been prominent 10 years ago. But I would say the lesson of the Northern Ireland peace process is you can talk to everyone. You can find a point of contact in discussion with everyone, and that's where you should begin. Not by separating good actors from bad actors. I've just been reading the work of, who's the founder of Palantir, this company that makes drones and surveillance equipment. He is an interesting individual who studied social theory in Frankfurt and was brought in to head this huge AI company. He talks the language of civilization and values. He doesn't, for the time being, end up where I think I might end up, but he does say that marketing of increasingly, marginally new products is not a proper vocation for human talent. So he's arguing that a company should have a social vision. And as I say, his social vision is rather nationalistic from an American point of view. But I'd love to have a chance to talk with him about that, because I think that I would agree with him that a company is not just there to make money. It used to be said the business of business is business. Yeah. But I think what he's saying is a different vision of business. And that's something we could work with maybe in a dialogue.
Make a better world. Yeah.
And we could, that's a starting point for dialogue.
Yes. Now, when you started describing the Dublin project, actually the national project, and the dialogue you said with the government, it struck me this is very parallel with the session that you and I were attending in the European Parliament last Tuesday for Article 17, which is a little known aspect of the EU, which I think Christians everywhere should know about. Because there's been a lot of discussion about God being left out of the Constitution, but actually something of far more consequence was that this legal obligation was set up for the European institutions to have a regular, transparent dialogue with churches, religious organizations, philosophical organizations, and in order to see the ethical basis. We were discussing the ethical basis of the budgets coming up for the next 7 years or so.
No, I agree with you there completely. You're absolutely right. The point of Article 17 is that the church or other churches, our church or other churches or other faith groups, they're not just NGOs, but there's something else out there. And I think Article 17 should be developed. It should be more ambitious in what we try to achieve. It should then have its counterpart in individual countries, and not just in the EU, but maybe beyond the EU. And it should also open the door to a new dimension in the European Union's external relations, which you could loosely call civilizational diplomacy, where we prepare within Article 17 for a dialogue, a deep dialogue with India, China, and others. That's what the OSCE was about, the CSCE. It was a deep dialogue with the Soviet Union. And that was with communism. And I was in that for years. And I can safely say that they often talked a lot of sense. If you look at the achievements of the old CSE in the end of the Cold War, much of that came from Moscow, including Gorbachev, who was probably by a wide margin the most impressive politician in that space. He was a politician who was prepared to lose rather than abandon values. And we need a bit of that. We need to redefine success to some extent. So Article 17 could be at the heart of a tremendous movement.
Yes, well, as we sat there and we listened to all these different contributors, and you had Catholic and ecumenical and Jewish, Muslim, even Freemasons,
Yes.
Buddhist, and others. But there was a commonality concerning the values. They were constant talk about human dignity and about the vulnerable. And
Yes.
and the rabbi told a story of a disciple who came to his rabbi to say, "How can I know I'm doing justice?" And the rabbi said, "Ask yourself who's not at the table." And at first, I was thinking, I wish all Europeans could witness this to realize what is actually going on there in Brussels on a regular occasion. And then I found myself thinking, I wish all Americans could hear this as well.
Yes, yes. Actually, the task that we've been given as our centre, and this has been, announced in our parliament, so it's not a confidential thing, but it's to try to work on the methodology for this dialogue so that everyone feels comfortable. And one of the conclusions I think we're coming to is that we need ecumenical and interfaith bodies and other non-confessional bodies to do a lot of prior thinking on how to put teams together for this dialogue. I think the more work that's being done under the dialogue, the more obvious it will be that everyone has to be invited to contribute, because the issue then is who is prepared to do the work, to do the hard work in thinking through these issues. And the European Union also has funding streams which could provide support for this dialogue. Vast amounts of money are poured into research on treatments for cancer and such things, but you could think of smaller amounts of money being used to encourage research in support of Article 17. So if it's decided to discuss the multi-annual financial framework or the criminal justice system or migration or some other great theme, why not have a call for proposals for people who are willing to get together and come up with ideas? What if the EU decided to have an intercivilizational dialogue with India, which is, the door is wide open there on the Indian side, and then called for proposals? How are we going to explain our European tradition to India? So I think Article 17 has immense promise.
Yeah. Well, this is so fascinating, and I'd love to unpack all of these topics, but let me just come to one last topic that has to do with Pope Leo the 14th. How he was speaking at the Food and Agricultural Organization meeting in October, that if hunger is defeated, peace will be the fertile ground from which the common good of all nations will spring. For him,
Yes.
the current state of affairs is a clear sign of prevailing insensitivity, a soulless economy, a questionable development model, an unfair and unsustainable system of resource distribution to allow millions of human beings to live and die in the grip of hunger is a collective failure. Yes, what's your comment on that?
Well, it's true is the main thing. But I think what is at stake here is our perspective. You can't really do politics without perspective. And what's happening in the world now is that there's a big retreat from development aid in many countries. And there's also the increasing use of the aid that remains for purposes of competition, basically. And we really need to reorient ourselves. I think the global military budgets are now at $3,000 billion and increasing. So we've completely lost a sense of proportionality in our public spending. And that means we've abandoned reason. I mean, Pope Benedict was very strong on the need for reason to inform religious thinking. And if you read what Pope Leo says about hunger, and then you read about the high hopes I say almost in inverted commas, but we have in particular segments of the arms industry as the means of ensuring growth, quote unquote, in the future. I think there's something very badly wrong there. And in fact, it's a whole mentality. I'm very interested in Thucydides, the greatest ancient historian. And he describes how three things converge. One is that we become complacent about the faults in our own action. We believe that the situation is too urgent and we have no time to really question ourselves. So we've just got to take our current posture as a given. Secondly, we despise anyone who seems to be our enemy. We don't allow ourselves to enter into their world. And then thirdly, and the most dangerous thing, is that we create a culture in which dissent is no longer possible. People who dissent are regarded as somehow passengers, awkward passengers on this great ship that's going somewhere. So Thucydides describes basically the degeneration of culture under the pressure of a certain kind of mindset. And I think that's what we're doing to ourselves to a large extent at the moment. Unless we can respond concretely to the challenge that Pope Leo has put to us, we won't be able to build a society based on consent and trust and mercy and hope in our own part of the globe. May I say also that Pope Leo's statement at the FAO is strongly complemented by Archbishop Paul Gallagher's statement at the UN General Assembly on the 29th of September, where Archbishop Gallagher outlined a whole vision of foreign policy on behalf of the Holy See. And at the center is the concept of an ecological debt, which is that the global north must be much more conscious of history and of the need to respond concretely to the increasingly urgent problems of the poor. We talk about values. Schuman in the Schuman Declaration talked about Africa, if I remember correctly.
That's correct.
Unless we connect with that global vision again, I think we're not going to be able to consolidate, a civilization in our own part of the world.
Yeah. Yes, he was saying if we get our act together in Europe, we'll be able to bless the rest of the world,
Yes.
particularly Africa. And that brings us back to this vision for the common good, not just for our own people, our own nation, even our own continent, but the whole world. Thank you very much, Philip. This has been a most fascinating and thought-provoking conversation. We're very grateful that you've taken the time to share with us in this way. And people can, why don't you just say what the website is? We'll have it here on the screen below of your college, of your center. This is the last for this year. And as we will open the new year, interviewing one of our guests from about 4 years ago, Dr. David Koisis, the author of Political Visions and Illusions, and more recently he's published Citizenship Without Illusions, and he's speaking to many of the current issues that are forcing us to think very deeply about the role of faith in the public square. And as David points out, as in our last interview about 4 years ago, each political ism is actually an idolatry where we take something of God's good created order and absolutize it. And we need to stand above that. And so he'll unpack that further as he explains what his book, Citizenship Without Illusions, is all about next month. Thank you very much indeed
Thank you,
for
Jeff.
joining us
Very
today.
much. Thank you.
Yeah.